Hello everyone. So it's finally time for the final exam. We've made it through Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, and Unit 4. And now is the final exam that's going to go over everything that's happened for all of the units. But most students find that the final exam is the easiest of all of them. For one thing, not only does it only have 4 options for each question, so all of the other exams there's A, B, C, D, E. This is only A, B, C, D. But the way that the final exam is also designed is there are 30 questions multiple choice, and then there are 20 questions where it's matching. And you'll see as we get in there with the review, but let's go ahead and get started. And so the very first thing that you will need to know is, of course, the definition of psychology. And so when we break down psychology, it's the study of the mind, but that's not good enough anymore. So when we talk about psychology, we are referring to the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So that is what we mean. That is how we define psychology. Then, moving on, one thing that we talked about in class, but there wasn't a specific slide about it, is this idea of a theory. This also goes way back to Exam 1, where you had a question on this. And it's a way to explain the relationship among observed events or experimental findings in ways that make them more understandable and predictable. So that's just a really fancy way of saying that we've seen something, we've observed something, we did some sort of study, now we're trying to explain it. We form a theory. Moving on, there's 2 kind of main types of research out there. We have basic research and we have applied research. The thing to know about this is when we talk about basic research, it's just trying to increase our basic understanding. We're just getting knowledge. That's it. We're just trying to get basic collection of data, information in general. Applied research, on the other hand, is trying to solve a specific problem. So applied research, we're using it, we're solving a problem. Basic research, just trying to get a better understanding. Now going on to neurons, there's 2 main types. We have afferent and efferent. The thing to remember about this is that afferent with an A is going from the body, or I should say the senses, to the brain. So senses to the brain is afferent with an A. And then efferent with an E is going from the brain, then out to the body. So I would remember that. And then when we're looking at an actual neuron and what makes up the neuron, there's different parts. I'm going to bring myself back because there was a way that we kind of visualized it. And so the way that we did was with our hand. And so you had way up here on the shoulder was the dendrites, and that was what was bringing in the information. Then that information makes it to the cell body, which has the neuron. And so then that cell body interprets that data, it passes on more of the information, and then it's sent down through the axon, and then eventually to the terminal button where the synapse and all that. But the way that we described this, or the way that we remembered kind of the basic parts, was reverse alphabetical order. Because you had dendrites with D, cell body, CB, and then going down the axon, A. So if you remember that reverse alphabetical order, you'll be good for the structure of a neuron. Next, we have, oops, and it's a little hard to see, so let me move that over, this idea of the corpus callosum. And so we watched a video about this in class, hopefully you remember, where there was someone whose corpus callosum was split. And the thing to remember about this is the corpus callosum is what communicates the 2 sides of the brain. And what's so interesting about how our brain is wired is that the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body, just like how the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body. And so it's the corpus callosum that then communicates those 2 hemispheres. Move ahead. And so now we get into this idea of sensation versus perception. And what you will need to know is essentially the definitions. And so sensations are the process in which information is taken in through the senses. So it's bringing information in through the senses. Whereas perception is we're taking that information and we're integrating, organizing, and interpreting it. And so we're trying to organize and understand that information. So sensation is being brought in through our senses. Perception is when the brain is then organizing and understanding that information. I also realize at the N, perception is off. Cat. All right. So now we get into sensory receptors. And these are specialized cells in sense organs that detect external stimulus. And so you see some examples here. You have the rods and cones in the eyes, the hair cells in the ears, taste cells in the tongue. These are all specialized cells in these sense organs, and they're what detect that information from the outside world. So these are sensory receptors. Then we get into Gestalt Principles. This has to do with how we are perceiving information. And so these are just some of the examples. You have closure, connectedness, continuity, but you also have the figure ground. You also have similarity. All of these are examples of Gestalt Principles. So I would make sure that you know just some examples of Gestalt Principles. Now we're getting into sleep. See how we kind of go through these chapters really quickly? And what you'll need to know for this is why we sleep. What's so important about sleep? And so the theories that we have out there right now is it serves as a protective function. It helps us conserve energy. It restores us. And then it helps to consolidate memories. So these are all theories as to why we sleep. Going on in sleep, there's different ways that we describe, though more importantly, why we dream. And so Freud had this whole idea of manifest content and latent content. There you go, so you can see everything. So manifest content is what you're actually dreaming about. So it's what manifested. It was actually there. Whereas the latent content is the underlying meaning, how we interpret that dream. So manifest is what you're actually dreaming about. Latent content is then how we interpret that. Then another theory for dreaming is the activation synthesis hypothesis. And this is the whole idea that there is random firing that is going on in the brain, and so the brain is making sense of that. And so that is activation synthesis hypothesis. Moving on, in the same chapter, we talked about hypnosis and some of the theories as to what's going on. For the sake of the final, I would focus on the neo-dissociation theory, and it's the whole idea that we kind of become split off or dissociated from ourselves and kind of become this hidden observer, and we're watching ourselves as we are being hypnotized. So that's the neo-dissociation theory. Now we're getting into learning. And so the thing to know about this, I'm going to be moving these PowerPoints ever so slightly every once in a while. There we go. The thing to remember about this is when we talk about operant conditioning, the kind of main components of operant conditioning are the idea of reinforcement and the idea of punishment. So when we talk about operant conditioning, it's learning through those consequences, the reinforcement and punishment. Going further into operant conditioning, we also have this idea of positive and negative, whether it's a reinforcement or punishment. And when it's something that is positive, it means that we are adding something. When it's something negative, it means that we are taking something away. So on the exam, you'll be given an example of some sort of conditioning, and you will need to figure out what type of conditioning it is, whether it's a reinforcement, so if they're trying to increase a behavior, whether it's a punishment, so trying to decrease a behavior, and then if it's positive, if they added something, or if it's negative, if they took something away. And another thing that has to do with learning is this whole idea of behavior modification. And what we mean by behavior modification is it's a learning principle to either strengthen adaptive behavior or weaken maladaptive behavior. So that just means that we are trying to increase a behavior that helps you and decrease a behavior that hurts you. That's what we mean by behavior modification. Next we get into memory. So you will need to know the components of memory. And this is something that was a little confusing on one of the other exams, because you have the components of memory, and then you have the types of memory. It gets confusing. But when we're talking about the components of memory, it is sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So that's what we mean when we talk about the components of memory. We also have, when we're trying to learn things and understand things, we have things known as heuristics. And heuristics kind of help us make decisions. It's based on experiences, so it's shortcuts that we make, and they help us, but they're not necessarily going to be the solution. So again, they're shortcuts. Is what we mean by heuristics. And this whole idea of heuristics and all of that go into a field of psychology known as cognitive psychology. And so what we mean by cognitive psychology is it's a branch of psychology that explores how we acquire knowledge about the world. So how we get information in, how we're getting that knowledge, how we think about it, how we process it, how we problem solve. This is all cognitive psychology. Now we're going to get into intelligence. The thing to remember about this, and this is something that quite a few people missed on the previous exam, is when we talk about interpersonal intelligence. And so interpersonal intelligence, according to Gardner, is kind of our social skills. So if you want to be a psychologist, if you want to be a therapist, if you want to be a social worker, any sort of job where you're interacting with other people and you have to have empathy and all that, you want to be high in interpersonal intelligence. And now we're going to talk about motivation. So this was the next chapter, and specifically the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So when we talk about intrinsic motivation, this is being motivated inside. So you feel good on the inside. Whereas extrinsic motivation is when you're motivated by things such as rewards or avoiding punishment. It's external motivation. Don't mind that noise. It is my cat who's currently having zoomies. Anyway, now we're talking about crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. The thing to know about this is that fluid intelligence is kind of the processing speed, and then more importantly for the final exam, when we talk about crystallized intelligence, it's our verbal ability and then just overall fund of knowledge. So that just means the knowledge that we have, the knowledge that we've acquired. That is our crystallized intelligence. And then there's an interesting question where it's kind of knowing theorists and the theories that they came up with. So the sexual response cycle was by Masters and Johnson. The drive reduction theory was Clark Hall. And then the hierarchy of needs was Abraham Maslow. And you are going to see his name again in the second part of this exam. So now we're going to get to stress, which hopefully this video will be helping to reduce when you're taking the final exam. And what we mean by stress is it is the pressures or demands placed upon us to adjust or adapt to our environment. So that's what we mean when we talk about stress. And related to stress is the general adaptation syndrome, which was designed by Hans Selye. So you will need to know that name. And it's our response to stress. So Hans Selye is the one who designed the general adaptation syndrome. So now we're going to talk about the idea of reciprocal determinism, which was created by Albert Bandura. And this is the whole idea that when we look at cognitions, environment, and behavior, they all have a mutual role in the development of our personality. So it's the whole idea that these three things all play a role in what determines our personality. Now we get to go into abnormal psychology, so the last chapter that we talked about. And when we talk about abnormal behavior, there's a lot of different questions that we can ask. And so, is it unusual? Is a person being a social deviant? Is it causing emotional distress? Are they exhibiting maladaptive behavior? Is it dangerous, what they're doing to themselves or others? And then, do they have a faulty perception or interpretation of reality? These are all questions that you might ask for abnormal behavior, which you will need to know. When categorizing mental disorders, we then use something known as the DSM. And the thing to know about this, which is very, very crucial, is that when it comes to diagnosing mental disorders, it doesn't matter if you're a therapist, it doesn't matter if you're a psychiatrist, it doesn't matter if, you're a humanistic psychologist, cognitive psychologist, behavioral psychologist, does not matter. For all fields of psychology in the United States, you must use the DSM for diagnosis. There are no exceptions. So that's the thing to know about the DSM. And then these last few slides actually go into chapter 14, which we did not get into. I am going to be covering it, but for the seniors in this class, we're kind of just doing a very, very brief version. But essentially, chapter 14 was all about different forms of therapy. And when we look at all the different fields of psychology, there's different forms of therapy for each field. So, you see here that you have, for the psychodynamic perspective, there's psychoanalysis, there's the humanistic therapies, the Gestalt therapies, you have behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, rational emotive behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy. All of these are examples of what we call psychotherapies. But in addition to psychotherapies, we also have something known as biological therapies. And one of the examples of biological therapies that we use is what we call electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. This used to be known as electroshock therapy, and it's not as severe as it used to be. It is far more controlled and humane, but this is a biological therapy, whereas all of the other ones that I had listed were psychotherapies. And so the very last thing before we get into kind of the second part of the final exam, and what you will need to know for that, is when we break down that psychodynamic therapy, what it's commonly referred to is psychoanalysis, and some various techniques that are used in psychoanalysis are things known as free association, where you just kind of say everything that's going on, everything that's, in your head pops into your mind. Dream analysis, which of course we talked about earlier with the manifest content and latent content. The use of interpretation, so it's looking at resistance, transference, all of that. These are all examples of psychoanalysis. So now we get into the second part of the exam. So what we just went over was the multiple choice section of things that you will need to know. The second part is matching, where you will see that there will be 4 different therapists, and then you need to match them with the theory or, the thing that they are most well known for. And it's going to be in groups of 4, but there will be 5 groups in total, or 5 sets. And so there's going to be 20 questions where it's matching, but it's split up, so that helps you a little bit. So the very first one that you will need to know is Freud. We've talked about Freud a lot. And the kind of biggest thing for Freud is this idea of the unconscious. So when you think of Freud, you should think the unconscious. Then we get into John B. Watson. He was the one who founded behaviorism. So he is the founder of behaviorism. Next is William Vaunt. And William Vaunt is the one who coined the phrase of introspection. So when you think introspection, that is William Vaunt. And then we get into Maslow, which I told you was going to be coming back. And Maslow was known for the humanistic perspective. And I know I always talk about Maslow and Rogers, but hold that thought. For now, just think Maslow. And then we get into the next set. We have Pavlov. He was the one who created classical conditioning. Then we get into Thorndike. And he was the one that had the idea of the law of effect. And then playing off of the law of effect, we then get into... I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get into who played off Thorndike, we have Bandura. And Albert de Bandura was the one that came up with observational learning, so learning through observing, or social cognitive learning. Then, playing off of Thorndike and the law of effect, we have B.F. Skinner, who then came up with operant conditioning. So for the third set, we have Spearman. Spearman had this idea of you had kind of your general intelligence, or the G factor, and then more specific intelligence, or the S factor. So he was the G and the S factor. We have Sternberg, who I've mentioned before is obsessed with triangles, because not only does he have the triarchic theory of love, but he also has the triarchic theory of intelligence. Then we get into Piaget, and he was kind of seen as the big person of cognitive development or cognitive psychology, and he's the one that came up with the stages of cognitive development. And then kind of a different theory or an alternative to Piaget was Vygotsky. And he is known for what is known as the zone of proximal development. And I remember one way that I've said for you to remember this is that Vygotsky has a lot of kind of weird letters in his name, so does zone of proximal development. Going into the fourth set, we have Kohlberg. Kohlberg had the theory of moral development. This is when you did the Heinz dilemma in class in your journal, all about stealing the medicine for his wife and all that. That was for the theory of moral development, which is Kohlberg. Then we have Erikson, who had the stages of the psychosocial development. So these are all the different crises that people could go through at different stages in their life. Then we have Kubler-Ross, or Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who had the kind of theory of how most people cope with death and dying. So I had the fun little video from Robot Chicken with the giraffe that was going through all the kind of stages of grief, as it's also commonly referred to as. And then we have Henry Murray, who had the thematic apperception test. So this was something that you did in class, where you were shown kind of a picture, and then you had to form a story based upon it. So it's one of those projective tests. And then the last set, we're almost done. And I told you Carl Rogers was going to come back. Again, Carl Rogers is the other one known for the humanistic perspective, though he is also known for the idea of conditions of worth. We then have some Neo-Freudians. So Alfred Adler, he had the idea of like the creative self, which I know we talked about, of being motivated to not feel inferior and all of that. But he also coined what's known as the individual psychology. Then we get into Raymond Cattell. And Cattell is the one that had the 16 PF, so the 16 personality factor when looking at what makes up our personality. And then finally, we have the Neo-Freudian Carl Jung, and he was the idea of the collective unconscious. So it played off of Freud with the idea of the unconscious, but he took it further, saying that there's this collective unconscious that everyone shares, and then certain archetypes. And that is it. So that should be everything that you will need to know for the final exam. I know I went really quickly, but again, the point of this is just kind of to be a brief review, not to actually be teaching the material. So if any of that was confusing, please go back to the previous chapters to watch the video for the associated theory. You can also always message me, email me, let me know if you need any clarification for anything. But I know that you guys are going to do great on the final exam. And then you'll be done. Minus the APA thing, but you'll see that.